I'm back on Battlefield 5. I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. The monitor is running in SDR, just in case you're wondering. You can see my frame rate towards the top right, or you might not be able to see because it's a tiny little green number, but it's 160. So this is a 160 Hz monitor. I've got the game running at a good solid 160 frames a second. So this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination gives you some advantages. It greatly improves the connected feel, and that describes the fluidity and the precision you feel when you're interacting with the game. If you compare this to a 60 Hz monitor, there's a massive difference. If you compare this to 120 Hz even, there's a bit of a difference. It also decreases the perceived blur due to eye movement. So perceived blur is a concept explored in an article on the website all about monitor responsiveness, and it's summarised a bit in the written review in the responsiveness section. But basically, most of the perceived blur you observe on a monitor is linked to your eye movement and linked to the refresh rate of the display at a matching frame rate. The other aspect of perceived blur is pixel responsiveness, but just before I go into some pursuit photographs, if you're not familiar, pursuit photography is explored a bit in that article I mentioned and summarised in the written review. But just before that, I have to mention input lag, but that also affects the connected feel, which I was talking about just before. And on this model, it's pretty low. Well, it's low. It's under 4 milliseconds. It's not super low, but it does indicate a low signal delay, which most users will be perfectly happy with. And remember that signal delay is the main element of input lag you feel. So with a low signal delay and a good high frame rate, high refresh rate combination and a decent frame rate and refresh rate, certainly gives you a nice level of connected feel. So back to those pixel responses and pursuit photography now. Here are some pursuit photographs on the screen using Blurbuster's Test UFO. Has various different overdrive settings, this monitor, off picture quality, balance and speed. There's also a smart OD setting, which is anything but smart. It really just has the overdrive set to a higher level than I'd like throughout the refresh rate range, so it's not a useful setting in my view. If you look at the written review, there are also some pursuit photographs at various lower refresh rates than 160, and also a comparison with the 28-inch models I've reviewed with the Inlux panel. So the XV282KKV is used as an example there, and that's a good fast monitor, compared at 144 Hz and a few lower refresh rates. It doesn't run at 160 Hz, which is why it's not used in this comparison here. I have to mention as well, although this is a 160 Hz monitor with an overclock, so you set something called DP refresh rate in the OSD, you have to actually adjust that from the default of 150 to 160 Hz. And you might find that you get some signal issues, screen blanking, or perhaps out of range issues with this. Then just stick to 150 Hz, wider compatibility. 160 doesn't necessarily work with all graphics cards, and really don't feel hard done by 150 versus 160 Hz. There is very little difference. The 10 Hz makes very little difference. Anyway, back to these pursuit photographs. I would recommend picture quality as the optimal setting here, although some may like to use balance if they're not too sensitive to overshoot, although it doesn't look too bad here. There were some brighter halo trailing examples that are significantly brighter than the background and stood out for that reason in practice, looking at a broader range of transitions than are shown here. But even with the transitions shown here, you can see that the speed setting really has strong overshoot and is not something which I'd recommend using, and it's not something which most people are going to want to use. Picture quality setting though, this is a decent performance level there. A little bit of powdery trailing behind the UFOs, nothing too distracting, nothing like VA smeary trailing, and also some IPS models have more distinct heavy powdery trailing, as I'd call it, than this. Still a pretty fast monitor. Isn't quite as fast as the 28-inch models I mentioned before in terms of its pixel responses, but I don't think it makes a massive difference even if you were using them side by side. I think the main difference most people would pick up on is actually that the 28-inch models have a bit more overshoot than this model does using its picture quality setting. And really in the way of overshoot, there's nothing to complain about, just a little bit here and there, some traces, doesn't stand out, isn't something I'd worry about. On another scene on Battlefield 5, and this one has a greater variety of high contrast transitions, so there are more dark shades in the mix, but often with contrasting backgrounds as well. And this can highlight some of the weaker transitions. So the weakest transitions this monitor performs, they are where dark shades or very bright or strongly saturated shades are involved. And even here, again, no massive weaknesses, just a bit of powdery trailing, as I like to call it in places. Just adds a little bit of a mask of perceived blur overall, but nothing dramatic. And really nothing to complain about in this scene either in the way of overshoot. And just more broadly, I've observed this monitor with a range of games and range of scenes, and really, with the picture quality setting, it is very much a low overshoot experience. The monitor also supports VRR, variable refresh rate technology, and you can use that with adaptive sync using AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, and that's what I'm using at the moment. I've got an RTX 3090 hooked up via DisplayPort, and you can also use FreeSync via HDMI with a compatible graphics card or compatible games console such as the Xbox Series X. The monitor also supports HDMI 2.1 VRR, and that means you can use VRR on compatible games consoles including the PS5. You can also use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode via HDMI 2.1. I did test G-Sync compatible via HDMI as well as DisplayPort, very similar experience on both. You can also use HDR at the same time as VRR if you wish, that's not a problem on this monitor. And overall, VRR does its thing, it gets a bit of tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches, works well. Didn't have any annoying issues with flickering or anything like that. I appreciate that this isn't officially G-Sync compatible certified. It likely would pass the certification, I don't see any reason it wouldn't if Gigabyte decided to make it go through that process, but they've gone for AMD FreeSync Premium Pro certification instead. But don't worry too much about these certifications, the end result and the experience here is just fine. I've now got the game running at 120 frames a second, and the monitor is responding by running at 120 Hz because I'm using VRR. There is a bit of an increase in overshoot now, but nothing strong or eye-catching. Of course, sensitivity to overshoot varies, so perhaps you would find it slightly eye-catching if you're particularly sensitive to overshoot, but honestly I think it's absolutely fine here. There is a decrease in connected feel and an increase in perceived blur just because of the lower frame rate. That isn't something which VRR can fix. 80 Hz, 80 frames a second now. Further increase in overshoot. And at this point, and just in general, if you're in the double digits a lot of the time, you might want to consider the off setting, which will get rid of the overshoot, but it does slow down the pixel transitions a bit. However, I do feel that with these relatively low refresh rates, double digit refresh rates, the pixel responses, even with the off setting, are quite decent, so you're not going to get a terrible experience either way. 60 Hz, 60 frames a second now, further increase in overshoot. You might even be able to see it in the video now. Even here, it's not extreme overshoot, but there are some eye-catching, or fairly eye-catching, halo trail examples. But again, you can use the offsetting if that's distracting you and you want to, and you're spending a lot of time in a particular game down here with your frame rates and refresh rates. But some people might just like to stick with picture quality all the way, so they could consider it a single overdrive mode experience if that's okay for them. But I do like the offsetting being an option, because if I think about the 28-inch models I've looked at, the Acer XV282KKV and the Asus VG28UQL1A, I think. It's hard to remember these model codes sometimes. I've got a lot of these swimming around in my head. And it will also apply to the Gigabyte M28U. They don't actually have an overdrive setting which will help with the overshoot at lower refresh rates. So there's always a bit of overshoot and quite a bit of overshoot, a moderate amount at lower refresh rates, regardless of the overdrive setting you select. So the M27U does improve on that. And for me, I feel that's quite important, because some console gamers, or if you don't have a particularly powerful GPU, or you just like to really ramp up the graphics settings, because a 4K UHD resolution is pretty demanding, you might want to just stick to that offsetting and have the low overshoot experience. And that's something you can do here. The VRR range of this one is claimed to be 48 to 160 Hz, and I can confirm that with my testing, although sometimes, and it just depends on the fluctuations occurring, the floor of operation would sometimes be closer to 55 Hz. This is something that I've observed on various monitors, not specific to this one, just an interesting little thing. It doesn't really make much difference to the user, but what you have to be aware of is that when the LFC boundary, as AMD would call it, low frame rate compensation, is crossed, then the monitor will stick to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate to keep tearing and stuttering at bay, and that does work well, but there is a bit of a crossover point, and there's subtle momentary stuttering when it crosses over in either direction. That is not specific to this monitor, it's something I always observe. And generally it's not going to be a problem. It's not as obvious as the stuttering you would get normally without VRR, and you don't get tearing introduced or anything like that. But if you are sensitive to this and you're frequently passing that boundary, then it is something to be aware of and potentially bothersome. Speaking of potentially bothersome, this monitor has a strobe backlight setting called Aim Stabilizer Sync. I wasn't able to get this to work reliably under VRR, and I explore this in the written review, and that's really a better format for exploring strobe backlight settings like this. There are some pursuit photographs as well if you're interested in some visuals. Basically, I would say that it's usable. Some people might like this, but it locks the brightness at a moderately high setting. The monitor uses KSF phosphors, and there are flickering and fringing issues as a result, which are very apparent to sensitive users like me when you're using strobe backlight settings, and I find it really annoying and distracting beyond the normal flickering you get with a strobe backlight setting. And it's not really perfectly tuned in terms of its overshoot levels or strobe crosstalk levels, but it's not terrible in that respect. So it's just a little bit messy, a bit artifacty really, and I don't really consider it an amazing implementation, but it's not terrible. So some people might still see some utility in it.